Chapter 1. My Dream House. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if I worked hard enough, I could earn peace. 10 years of missed weekends, late night showings, and coffee dinners finally gave me the keys to a small craftsman home in Seattle, a space that felt like mine in every sense. But peace doesn't always survive family. My parents said I was lucky to have what I had, so I should share it. My brother said moving in with me would help him get his life together. And for a while, I almost convinced myself that letting him take over my space was what good daughters do. Until the day I realized that love built on guilt isn't love at all. So when he stood at our family dinner smiling and announced he'd be moving into my house, I didn't argue. I just smiled back because I already knew the house wasn't mine anymore. Spring 2021. The air in Seattle still carried that cool, damp smell of rain when I finally turned the key to my own front door. 10 years of long hours, endless showings, missed birthdays, and eating dinner in my car between open houses had led to this moment. The sound of the latch clicking open felt like an applause no one else could hear. My house. A 3-bedroom craftsman in Bellevue, with white trim, a bay window that faced the morning sun, and hardwood floors that creaked just enough to feel alive. I stood there with the keys in my hand, letting the silence wrap around me. The walls smelled faintly of fresh paint and cedar polish. I should have been overwhelmed with happiness, but a small voice in the back of my mind was already calculating mortgage payments, property taxes, and the maintenance list that came with a century-old house. I had worked every day since I was 24 to make this happen. I started at Keller & Nash Realty as an assistant who fetched coffee, staged empty homes, and picked up phone calls that went nowhere. The first 5 years were all rejection, and the next 5 were just survival. I finally closed enough listings to afford this down payment. I didn't need anyone to sign a check for me, and that was the whole point. My father Thomas, a retired accountant, said he was proud but reminded me to track every expense in a spreadsheet. My mother Margaret baked a pie and told me not to work too hard decorating. My brother Ethan, who was 31 and still living with them, barely looked up from his phone when I told him I bought a house. He said something like, "Must be nice to have your life figured out." Then he asked if I had a guest room. It wasn't the first time Ethan saw my achievements as an inconvenience. Growing up, it had always been that way. I still remember the summer I turned 14. I had saved $200 babysitting and planned to buy a used guitar from a neighbor. The night before I was going to pick it up, Mom came into my room holding my little brother's report card. He had failed math again and needed a summer tutor, she said gently. "He needs a chance, honey. You're good with money. You can earn it back." I handed her the envelope without saying anything, and that moment settled into my bones. In our family, I was the responsible one, the one who never needed help. Years later, I thought buying my own home would finally change that story. I thought it would prove something. The first month was blissful. I spent weekends sanding down old cabinets, hanging curtains, learning which light switch controlled which outlet. The house wasn't big, but it was mine. Then one Wednesday morning, I noticed a dark stain under the kitchen sink. I crouched down, touched the wood, and felt it soft and cold. Water was dripping steadily from a pipe. By the weekend, the leak had spread to the main line. The plumber arrived on a gray Saturday afternoon. He was in his 50s, smelling faintly of diesel and coffee. He knelt, took one look, and sighed. "You've got more than a leak," he said. "The whole line is corroded, probably 40 years old." I tried to sound calm. "So what are we looking at? A few hundred?" He wiped his hands on his jeans. "Try 12,500 if we do it right. Could be more if the main's damaged." My chest tightened. I crouched beside him, feeling the damp air under the sink. There was a faint hum of water behind the wall, steady and mocking. I pulled out my phone and began filming the drip for insurance, pretending I wasn't panicking. The plumber waited politely, then said, "Sorry, kid. Houses this old are like people. Once one part goes, everything else starts complaining too." I nodded. He wasn't wrong. After he left, I sat on the kitchen floor with the estimate in my lap. The paper was smudged where a few drops of water had landed. I ran my thumb over the numbers, tracing them like a scar. 12,500. My emergency fund could cover it barely, but that meant no cushion for anything else. The sound of the dripping didn't stop when I turned off the water. It echoed in my head long after a reminder that stability could crumble overnight. I thought about calling my dad for advice, but I could already hear his tone, the kind that started with a sigh. "You should have had the line inspected more carefully," and my mom, soft but firm, saying, Don't worry, sweetie, Ethan just needs help getting back on his feet. We'll figure it out. Instead, I grabbed a towel and pressed it against the wet floor, watching the water seep through the fabric. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping against the window pane like an echo. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The air smelled of damp wood and fresh paint. I whispered to no one I thought I was buying peace of mind. Then I let out a tired laugh. Turns out I just bought another kind of responsibility. The lights flickered once the old wiring humming, and for the first time I realized this house might be the biggest test I'd ever taken. Chapter 2. Cracks Deeper Than the Walls. The following Monday, I sat across from Samantha Reed in her downtown office, the smell of roasted coffee mixing with printer ink and faint perfume. She had been my financial advisor for 3 years, the only person who never sugar-coated numbers for me. Her office was spotless white walls, a single plant that somehow stayed alive without sunlight. She adjusted her glasses and tapped her pen on the calculator. "Claire, you're what we call house poor. You have equity, sure, but all your money is stuck inside those walls. One plumbing issue and you're sinking again." I stirred the coffee she had offered, but didn't drink it. It tasted like guilt already. "So what are you saying, Sam? Sell it." Samantha leaned forward. "The market's hot right now. Bellevue prices are up 12% this quarter. If you list soon, you could walk away with a decent profit and start fresh somewhere smaller, maybe closer to the city." I forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. I worked 10 years for that place. It's not just a house. She gave me that look only older, steadier women give when they've already seen the story play out. Sometimes the hardest thing is admitting a dream turned into a liability. Think about it. On the drive back to Real Edge, Realty Seattle's sky hung low, heavy with rain. My phone buzzed with reminders for open houses and client calls. The car smelled faintly of damp umbrella fabric. I rehearsed what I'd say to my boss if I were ever brave enough to ask for a raise, but courage felt like a luxury item these days. At the office, Harvey's voice cut through the chatter the second I walked in. "Meeting room 10 minutes. He never said please." The conference room was a mix of fake enthusiasm and stale pastries. Harvey stood at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, reciting numbers about sales quotas. Then he looked right at me. "Claire, your numbers are fine, but try not to let your personal projects get in the way of work." I blinked. Personal projects. He meant the house. He smirked as if reading my mind. "Single women always overextend themselves emotionally and financially. You'd be amazed how many burn out trying to prove they can do it all." A few chuckles floated around the table. My throat tightened, but I smiled anyway, pretending to write notes. When the meeting ended, Monica, my closest coworker, walked by and muttered under her breath, "Ignore him. He still lives off his ex-wife's alimony." I almost laughed. By the time I got back to my desk, I wanted to disappear into the spreadsheets and listings. I answered calls, scheduled showings, smiled through everything until the day ended. The rain outside had turned to a steady drizzle, blurring the parking lot lights into streaks of gold. I started the car, the heater blowing lukewarm air, when my phone rang again. Mom. Her voice always carried that mix of warmth and subtle guilt. "Hi, sweetheart. I hope you're not too busy." I wasn't, I just didn't want to talk. "What's going on, Mom?" "Ethan's lease is up. His landlord's raising the rent again. It's awful what they charge these days." "You've got so much space, honey. Maybe let him stay for a few months while he figures things out." The words hit me like I'd been expecting them all along. I watched raindrops slide down the windshield, gathering, merging, falling. "Mom, I'm really tight on money right now. It's not the best time." She sighed, the sound soft but sharp. "Of course, I just thought since you live alone it might help both of you. He can help around the house, mow the lawn, maybe even cook for you." I almost laughed at the idea of Ethan mowing anything. I said I'd think about it then, hung up before she could thank me. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flickered. The leak had been fixed, but the kitchen still smelled faintly of mold. The house felt quieter than before, like it knew I was running out of excuses to stay. Later that week, Monica stopped by my cubicle holding a file folder and her usual cup of peppermint tea. "Got a couple looking for something in your area," she said. "Liam and Jenna Parker. Tech people, no kids, want something with character. Maybe your place fits the bill." I hesitated, then took the folder. "Let me think about it." The next day, I met the Parkers briefly during a showing. They were polite, young, and bright-eyed, the kind of couple that made every old house look like a new chapter. Jenna admired the molding. Liam talked about raising a dog in the yard. Their excitement stirred something in me, a whisper I didn't want to hear yet. Maybe it was time. That evening, as I was finalizing paperwork for a roof repair, my phone buzzed again. A message from Mom. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, until I saw it. Ethan asleep on their couch, mouth slightly open, a blanket half covering him. The caption read, "Just until he figures things out." The noise of the office faded around me. My pen slipped from my hand, rolling across the desk until it stopped at the edge. My heart sank the way it always did when I realized a decision had already been made for me. I finished signing the repair contract, thanked the contractor on the phone, and packed my bag. The rain was steady again, washing the streets in silver. Seattle looked beautiful in the dark, the skyline reflecting on wet pavement. But beauty didn't comfort me anymore. Driving home, the windshield wipers kept rhythm with my thoughts. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked tired, older somehow. Every mile felt heavier, as if the city itself was pressing down on me. I gripped the steering wheel and whispered under my breath, "Whenever my family needs someone to fix their mess, they always look at me." The wipers clicked once more, steady as a heartbeat, as I turned onto my street and watched the house appear through the rain, standing there quiet and waiting. Chapter 3. When Love Turns into Obligation. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine ticking down, the porch light making a weak halo on the wet steps. Inside the house had that chill that old wood carries after a long rain. I dropped my bag on the entry table and stood there listening to the refrigerator hum and the slow drip I still swore I heard, even though the plumber had fixed it. My phone buzzed. Mom had texted that she and Dad would swing by the next afternoon with dinner. I typed back that I would be home. The morning came with a sky the color of steel and a thin veil of fog over the street. I made coffee and opened my laptop at the kitchen table, scanning MLS updates and answering clients. Every task felt heavier than it should, like running through sand. At noon, I gave up and started straightening the living room. I fluffed the couch pillows and folded a throw blanket, then laughed at myself for wanting the house to look effortless. They arrived with a knock that sounded almost apologetic. Dad went straight to the counter with a casserole dish wrapped in foil and a grocery bag that smelled of fresh bread. Mom moved slowly behind him, her smile bright and careful. She touched my arm and said I looked thin. I told her work had been busy and that I was fine. She nodded as if I had said what she hoped to hear. We sat at the table with coffee while the oven warmed the casserole. They asked about clients and the market and if I still liked the neighborhood. I answered the way a polite daughter answers, with details that mean little and tone that hides the real thing. After a while, the shape of the conversation shifted. Mom glanced toward the hallway where the guest room door stood open, and she said that my brother only needed a few months. She said those exact words, the ones that have lived in our family for years. "Ethan only needs a few months. You have a spare room." I felt my mouth turn into a smile that had nothing to do with joy. I said I had not planned to take in a roommate. She reached for my hand and said she worried about me here alone, that it would be nice to have someone around who could carry groceries or fix a light bulb if I needed. Dad cleared his throat and added that living alone was not safe anyway and that I should not be stubborn about help. I told them the plumbing had been expensive, that money was tight right now. Dad replied that this was exactly why Ethan staying would make sense. He could pitch in while he got back on his feet. Mom said she had already told him not to feel ashamed and that family was family. I stared at the steam rising off the coffee and felt the heat on my face. All I could see was a loop of the same old movie with a new setting, the scene where I carry what everyone else has dropped. For a second, I drifted back to 2010, to a tiny dorm room that smelled like laundry soap and ramen. I worked mornings at the campus bookstore, evenings at a diner on Lake City Way. My feet ached all the time, and my hands always smelled like coffee. I called home on Sundays during my break, and Mom would tell me how hard Ethan was trying and how tuition would be such a burden for him. The day he quit school, Dad transferred money to help him figure things out. He told me the timing for his help was delicate and that I always seemed to land on my feet. I remember hanging up the phone with my apron still tied and wondering why landing on my feet felt so much like falling alone. Back at the kitchen table, Mom said she would feel better at night knowing I was not by myself. She said Ethan could sleep on the couch until we set up the guest room. The words we hung in the air. We. As if I had already agreed. I took a breath and said I would think about it. I used the same calm voice I used with clients who were about to make a mistake. Dad looked satisfied. Mom squeezed my hand, relieved that a decision had been placed gently into my lap. We ate without talking much. The casserole was good and too rich. When they left, Mom hugged me tight at the door and told me I was a good daughter. The compliment felt like a coin placed in a jar I no longer wanted to keep. I washed dishes slowly. The window above the sink fogged up, and I traced a circle in the condensation before wiping it away with the back of my wrist. I dried my hands and stood in the hallway looking at the guest room. I had painted it a soft blue when I moved in, the kind of color that makes you think of early morning. The closet door was ajar, and there was a stack of moving boxes I still had not unpacked. I pictured Ethan's duffel bag in the corner, and my stomach turned. I picked up my phone and scrolled through contacts until I found a number Samantha had once given me for a lawyer who handled real estate documents. I called and left a message, my voice steady. He returned the call within the hour and offered to meet that evening if I did not mind coming by late. He had another closing to finish and would be in his office downtown anyway. By 7, I was riding the elevator up to a floor with quiet carpet and the faint smell of lemon cleaner. Carter Jones looked like he had been born wearing a suit. Not expensive flashy, but one of those classic ones that never go out of style. His office had tall windows and a view of lights prickling across the city. He shook my hand and asked if I wanted water. I said no and sat. I told him about the house, the mortgage, the leak, the way the numbers boxed me in. I told him I needed to understand my options and I needed to protect myself. He listened without interrupting, which felt like a small mercy. Then he opened a folder and began to explain what selling would actually require. He said I had sole ownership and that no one else had legal claim or standing to block a sale. He said my mortgage lender would need notice and that I should expect closing costs and fees. He talked about timelines and inspections, and he wrote down a conservative estimate that still looked better than any feeling I had had in months. I asked about taxes and whether I would be punished for choosing peace over pride. He said if this house was my primary residence, and if I met the time tests, there were exclusions for gains that might apply. He recommended talking through specifics with a tax preparer once we had a contract in hand. What mattered now was whether I wanted to sell and when I wanted the process to start. I stared at his pen on the desk and pictured Mom's text, Ethan asleep on their couch, the caption that tried to sound temporary. I weighed the silence of this office against the noise in my head. Carter slid a single sheet across to me and said this was a preliminary listing authorization, not a commitment to a brokerage, but a legal starting place for him to draft the necessary documents and to verify title and liens. He said signing it tonight would let him begin the work in the morning. He did not push, he just waited. I picked up the pen. My hand did not shake. The loop in my head slowed. I signed my name. The letters looked like someone who remembered who she was. Carter nodded once and said he would email next steps by noon tomorrow, and that he would move efficiently. I thanked him and stood. He walked me to the door. The hallway smelled like the end of a long day, tired paper and cooling electronics. The elevator hummed, and when the doors opened, I stepped in and watched the numbers tick down. Outside, the mist softened everything. The city felt quieter, as if someone had turned down the volume. I pulled my coat tighter and started toward the parking garage. A streetlight flickered and a bus hissed to a stop across the intersection. I could hear the faint echo of my footsteps and a far-off siren. I lifted my face to the damp air and breathed. If I had to choose between peace and self-respect, I would choose myself. Chapter 4. The Dinner of Truth. 3 weeks moved like rain on glass, steady and slightly blurred. Inspections and appraisals flowed into emails and signatures, then into a morning at the title office, where the Parkers smiled with that brand new chapter look I remembered from my first day here. The final number landed at $480,000, 5% above what we had asked, and I heard the escrow officer speak in that calm voice that sounds the same in every city. Funds confirmed, documents recorded. I asked her to take a short video on my phone. As I signed the last page, a simple clip that showed the stack of papers, the date stamp, and the bank portal flashing completed. I put the phone in my bag and told no one. By Sunday, the sky had cleared into a pale strip of evening, and I drove to my parents' house with a knot in my stomach that would not listen to reason. The driveway was full. A stranger could have guessed it was a celebration by the way the porch light glowed and the front windows shimmered. Inside, the dining room looked like a photograph from a glossy magazine. White tablecloth, fine china, the crystal flute glasses that lived in the cabinet all year waiting for Easter and promotions and graduations. A bottle of champagne rested in a bucket with a clean towel folded beside it. Mom had polished the silver. The smell of roast chicken and lemon cleaner mingled in the air. Margaret met me at the door with that bright smile that always made me suspicious. She touched my cheek and said how beautiful I looked, then smoothed a non-existent wrinkle on my sleeve. Dad came from the kitchen carrying a platter, nodded at me, then looked down again like his eyes had found much safer work to do. I set a small bouquet on the counter and offered to help, but Mom had already arranged everything. She told me to sit and relax. Her hands fluttered the way they did when she had decided an outcome in advance. Ethan arrived last. He wore a pressed shirt and a navy jacket I had never seen before. His hair was neater than usual, his shoes actually polished. He moved with a buoyant energy that made the air around the table shift. Mom poured champagne, filled each glass delicately, then set the bottle back in the bucket. She announced grace short and generic, more a ritual than a prayer. We sat. There was small talk about traffic on the bridge and a joke about the mariners. Dad complimented the bread which he had bought, and Mom corrected him gently by naming the bakery, as if the detail were important. Ethan drummed his fingers once on the table, then lifted his glass. His voice took on that tone I remembered from his high school plays, the one he used right before the curtain fell. Starting next week, he said, I will be moving into Claire's house. He tipped his glass in my direction like this was a toast we had rehearsed. The room went so quiet that I could hear the fizz inside my glass. Mom clasped her hands to her chest and beamed eyes damp, as if this were the solution heaven itself had mailed to our doorstep. Dad puffed his cheeks and nodded in that half-proud, half-relieved way that always made me feel like a spreadsheet had finally balanced. I set my glass down. I had practiced this in my head all afternoon, the calm voice, the straight back, the refusal to apologize for facts. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. There is something you should see, I said, my voice even. I tapped the screen, pulled up the short video from the title office, and pressed play. The escrow officer's hand crossed the frame, the camera panned to the stack of signed documents, the bank portal glowed completed. The date and time stamped in the corner made everything plain. At first they did not understand. They stared like I had shown them a travel clip from some place they had never wanted to visit. Then the recognition settled, slow and heavy. Mom leaned forward, her face softening and collapsing at once. She said that I had sold it. She did not ask it as a question. She said it like someone naming a death. Yes, I said. The new owners move in next month. Ethan's face changed in a way I had seen before. It hardened like wet cement in sun. He slammed his palm on the table. Silverware jumped. You did this to spite me, he said. You waited until I needed you, and then you pulled the rug out. I kept my eyes on him and felt that old panic try to rise, the reflex that begged to smooth and explain and make peace. I did not let it. No, I said. You are the only one who did not understand that house was mine. You made plans with something that did not belong to you. Mom began to cry, a soft sound that seemed to embarrass her even as it escaped. She reached for the napkin and dabbed at her eyes. She said she just wanted the family together and that I knew how worried she was about me being alone. She said she wished I had told them. Dad did not speak. His hands were folded on the table, the fingers tight, the knuckles pale. He looked older than I had ever seen him. Ethan stood so fast his chair scraped the floor. He pointed at me as if he could use his finger to push me back into the role he preferred. He said I was selfish, that I liked watching him struggle, that I got some kind of thrill out of making things harder than they had to be. He pushed away from the table, the legs of the chair knocking against the rug, and stormed down the hall toward the front door. The sound of it closing carried through the house like a gust of wind. The table was a mess of halted gestures and cooling food. Champagne sweated down the bottle. A tiny bubble clung to the inside of my glass and did not break. Mom whispered that she did not understand why I had done this without telling them. I told her that I had not told anyone because I needed to make a decision without being talked out of it. She said that families talk things through. I said that talking had always meant I had to bend. She pressed the napkin to her mouth and nodded as if acknowledging a point on a quiz she had not studied for. Dad finally spoke. He asked if it was final. I said it was. He asked if the price had been fair. I said it had. For a moment, I saw something pass across his face that looked like respect. Then it vanished, replaced by the weight of the evening. We tried to resume dinner, like actors picking up a scene after the prop table falls. It did not work. Mom pushed peas around her plate and my fork found nothing it wanted. The clock in the next room ticked in steady accusation. At last, Mom said she needed to check on the dessert and fled to the kitchen. I heard cupboard doors open and close in a frantic rhythm that did not match any recipe I knew. Dad stood and took the champagne to the sink. He let the water run over the bottle like cooling a fever. He stayed there longer than needed. I watched his back and felt that strange ache that comes when you love someone who cannot step toward you. I gathered my things quietly. The bouquet I had brought looked out of place on the immaculate counter, bright and helpless. Mom returned with plates she had not filled. She saw my bag on my shoulder and nodded. That small nod carried a lifetime of, "Yes, dear, and we will see and maybe later." She touched my hair like I was 8 and on my way to school. "Drive safe," she said. The words came out thin. Dad walked me to the door, then stopped. He seemed about to say something, then chose silence. I understood. It was easier to keep the peace that way. The porch light cast a soft circle on the steps. The night was cool, and the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels full. In the car, I sat with my hands on the wheel and my eyes closed. The video on my phone was still open. The frame paused on my hand, penning my name. For a second, I hated that I needed proof to be believed. Then I put the phone face down on the seat and took a slow breath. On the drive back to Bellevue, the radio murmured from some distant station and the road unfurled in wet shadows. I thought about Ethan's face when he made that announcement. It was not joy, it was ownership. He had spoken as if I belonged to the plan. A light turned green. I kept going. When I reached my street, the house stood dark, the porch light on a timer that had not yet learned the new schedule of my life. I unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet. The air held the faint smell of lemon soap and rain. I set my bag down and leaned against the wall. Somewhere a neighbor closed a window. It felt like the city exhaled with me. I turned off the porch light and watched the room settle into shadow. The hum of the refrigerator sounded steady again, not like a warning anymore, just a machine doing what it was meant to do. I poured a glass of water and sat at the table, hands wrapped around the cool rim, listening to the gentle tick of the clock and the softer rhythm of my breath. Chapter 5. When the Truth Breaks Everything. My phone started buzzing before sunrise, a steady stream of messages lighting the room in small jolts. Ethan first sent rage and then sent reasons. He said I had ruined his plan, then he said he was sorry for shouting, then he said if I cared about family I would make this right. I watched the bubbles stack like a tower with no foundation. I put the phone face down and made coffee. The kitchen sounded too large around me, every cupboard echoing when I closed it. By late morning I answered only with a short line that the sale was final and the move-out date was set. He replied with a flurry of blame, and then with a photograph of a duffel bag on our parents' living room floor. The caption said he was staying there only until he figured things out. I felt that old knot tighten again. I set the phone on the counter and took a long breath. Mom called in the afternoon. I could hear her trying to hold her voice steady and failing. She said I had gone too far and that he had nowhere to live. I told her softly that I understood this was hard to watch, but that I was not canceling the sale. I told her I was not responsible for his mistakes. She started to list all the ways Ethan had been trying. I kept my voice even and repeated that I would not undo what I had put in motion. She hung up after a long pause that felt like a door closing in slow motion. Work did not wait for my family to calm down. At Real Edge, the office buzzed with the usual Monday noise, printers and phones, and the smell of old coffee in the break room. Harvey called a hallway huddle near the glass wall. He looked at me with that sly patience I had come to recognize and said in front of 3 agents that selling your own house must mean you are desperate. A couple of heads turned and then turned away, pretending to study the market board. Heat crawled up my neck, and for a second I tasted the same smallness I had swallowed at that dinner table. I stepped forward and said that I had sold at a profit in a fast market, that I had negotiated clean conditions and a flexible timeline, and that any agent at this firm should know there is nothing desperate about a strategic exit. My voice did not wobble. Harvey blinked. Monica gave the tiniest nod from the corner. The silence that followed did not feel hostile. It felt like space I had carved for myself. Harvey muttered something about getting back to work and moved on. People pretended not to react, which is how approval often looks in offices like ours. My hands shook later at my desk, and then eventually they stopped. The next day, my father came to see me. He called first and asked if I had a minute. His suit jacket was older than I remembered, and he carried a paper folder even though everything we did was online now. We sat in a small conference room that smelled faintly of dry erase marker. He asked if I was doing all right, and then asked if there was any way to share a little from the sale with Ethan so he could start over. He said it would not take much to get him stable. I felt myself brace against the table. I told him I was paying off repairs and setting aside money for a smaller place, and that I needed a cushion because I did not ever want to be one crisis away from panic again. He reminded me that family helps family. I said helping is not the same as enabling. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and unfamiliar in our mouths. He looked at his folded hands, then said he was only asking. I said I knew. He asked if it was final, and I said yes. For a moment he almost smiled, like he saw a version of me he respected, even if he did not understand her. Then he stood and said he had to get back to the house, that Mom was not sleeping well. He paused at the door and told me to take care of myself. It was the closest he had come to choosing me over the old story. By midweek, the gossip had found its current. An aunt texted to say she had heard there was a misunderstanding and that maybe I could be kinder about timing. A cousin I barely spoke to messaged that he had always admired my work ethic, but that sharing is what families do. A neighbor slipped a line into a community thread about how people sell their homes without warning and how that kind of secrecy breeds mistrust. I typed and deleted replies until the app felt like a trap. Then I closed it and called the leasing office in Ballard I had flagged weeks earlier when I first met with Carter. They had a studio with a small balcony and a view of the city lights if you leaned far enough to the left. I packed in the evenings one room at a time, folding and sorting, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Each box felt like a small confession. The house sounded different without pictures on the walls, the echo sharper. The Parkers came by for a final walkthrough, and Jenna touched the banister the way you touch something you plan to care for. Liam asked a friendly question about the neighborhood garbage pickup, and I answered like a neighbor passing a torch. When they left, I stood in the doorway and felt both smaller and lighter. At the office, Harvey could not help himself. He made another snide remark in a morning meeting about agents who cannot manage their personal finances. This time I did not wait for permission. I said that closing a profitable sale in a volatile market takes skill, and that using my own property to make a sound financial decision had no bearing on my ability to manage clients. I added that what undermines performance is condescension, and that our team worked better when people were treated as professionals. The room went quiet. Harvey stared as if I had spoken a language he did not expect me to know. Monica smiled openly this time. Another agent, Daniel, changed the subject and asked about weekend showings, which felt like a small protective act. After work, I met with Carter one last time to sign a few remaining documents and to confirm the prorations. He explained that the final disbursement had cleared and that the timeline set by the contract would stand. He spoke in that steady tone that made numbers feel like guardrails instead of threats. I thanked him, and he said he was glad I had come in when I did. He did not say anything else and did not need to. We shook hands, and I left with a folder that was lighter than it should have been. Move-out day arrived with gulls circling the gray sky and a drizzle that started and stopped like static. Monica came by with tape and coffee. We loaded her trunk and my hatchback with boxes. The last thing I carried to the car was a small plant that had survived my uneven attention. I watered it before I set it on the passenger seat. The living room looked staged again, bare and clean like a breath held for too long. I turned once in the doorway and then closed it gently. The studio in Ballard was on the third floor of a building with blue mailboxes and a laundry room that smelled like soap and pennies. The space was simple. A wall of windows, a tiny kitchen, a closet that would require honesty. I set down a box and opened the glass door to the balcony. The city stretched out in a collage of lights and roofs and clouds. I leaned left, and there it was, a thin band of water reflecting a bruised evening sky. It was not the view I had dreamed of, but it was mine for now, and it did not ask me to prove anything to it. Mom texted late that night. She said she hoped I was safe and that she had made soup if I wanted to stop by. I stared at the screen and pictured her stirring a pot in a quiet kitchen, worry moving her hands in a circle. I wrote that I was okay and that I had a long day tomorrow. She sent a heart. I put the phone down and listened to the new sounds of this place. Someone laughed down the hall. A bus sighed outside and then moved on. I stood at the window with the room dark behind me and the city lit beneath. My reflection looked like a ghost layered over the lights. I felt the same ache and the same relief, a twin sensation that was starting to feel familiar. Maybe losing a house was just the price of freedom. Chapter 6. When the Spoiled Face Consequences. The first chill of November came early that year, and the rain in Seattle stopped pretending to be gentle. It fell in long diagonal sheets, drumming on the metal railing outside my apartment. I was sitting at my small table with a cup of black coffee and a stack of listing papers when the first message arrived from Mom. It was short and uneven, as if written between phone calls. Something bad has happened with Ethan. Call when you can. I waited a full hour before calling. When she answered, her voice trembled like she was holding it together with both hands. She said Ethan had been investing in some kind of tech startup with a few friends, that they had promised quick returns, that he had used the money she and Dad had given him to buy in. Now it was gone. Investors were threatening to sue because Ethan had been the one collecting their checks. The founders had vanished. I could almost see her sitting at the kitchen table with her head bowed, the house too quiet, Dad pacing near the sink. She said Dad had already called Carter Jones to ask what to do. I said I was sorry she was going through this and asked if she was okay. She said she had not slept in 2 nights. Then she said softly that maybe this was her fault, that she had believed him when he said he could make it work this time. I told her to let Carter handle the rest and that I had to go back to work. I hung up and stared at the rain, watching it gather in the grooves of the balcony. 2 days later, Carter called me. His tone was the same steady calm he used when explaining contracts, but there was a trace of fatigue underneath. He said Ethan's case was messy. The money trail was sloppy, and some of the investors were local professionals who had already filed complaints. He said it might end as a civil matter if no one pushed for fraud. I asked what Ethan had told him. Carter said that Ethan believed he was just helping manage the funds, that he had not meant to mislead anyone. I thanked him for telling me. Then I said something that surprised even me. I told him to help Ethan understand the law, but not to save him. There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Carter said he understood. That night, Mom texted again, asking if I could come by the house because Dad was worn out and she was scared. I sat on the couch with the phone in my hand and typed that I had a late showing and that it might run long. It was not a lie. I had clients that night, but I could have gone later. I chose not to. By the end of the week, the story had begun to travel through our extended family. An aunt called to say that Ethan had always been too trusting. A cousin sent a message about how unfair business could be. No one mentioned accountability. Dad stopped by my office one afternoon, looking smaller than I remembered. His jacket hung loose and his eyes had that tired glassiness that comes after too many nights without rest. He said they had met with Carter again. The lawyer had been professional and patient, but clear that Ethan might be sued for misrepresentation. There was a chance of settlement if they could repay a portion quickly. Dad rubbed his forehead and said he might cash in part of his retirement. I told him that was not a good idea. He said he knew, but did not see another way. The next morning, I drove by their house before work, parking down the street so I could see it without being seen. The curtains were drawn. The yard looked the same, the porch light still working, but something in the air felt different. A kind of silence that comes when people stop pretending everything is fine. Mom started seeing a therapist the following week. She told me about it during a short call, her voice soft, almost embarrassed. She said she had been having panic attacks and that the doctor told her to write things down. She said she was supposed to list what she regretted and what she still had control over. Then she whispered that maybe they had spoiled Ethan so much that they had lost their daughter in the process. I did not know what to say. I said I loved her. It was true, but it did not fix anything. At the office, the days blurred. Listings closings, a couple of new clients. I kept moving because stopping meant thinking. One Friday afternoon, Monica walked by my desk and asked if I was okay. I said yes, but my voice was too quick. She left a cup of tea on my desk anyway and went back to her calls. The following Tuesday, Ethan showed up without warning. I saw him through the glass wall before he reached my office door. His hair was a mess, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, his shirt half tucked like he had dressed in a hurry. He walked straight in, ignoring Monica's attempt to stop him. My coworkers pretended not to notice. He stood in front of my desk, dripping from the rain. His face was a mix of fury and disbelief. "Are you happy now?" he said. The room felt smaller. I kept my tone level. "No," I said. "But I finally stopped carrying what is not mine." He slammed his hand on the desk, making a paperweight jump. "You think you're better than everyone because you can walk away from things. You left me to drown." I stood up. "You are not drowning. You are learning to swim without using other people as a life raft." His mouth opened, but no sound came. For a second, I saw something break behind his eyes, something like fear. Then he turned and left his wet shoes, leaving dark prints down the hall. I felt the air return to the room in slow pieces. Monica came in quietly and closed the door. She did not ask what had happened, she just said, "Take a minute," then left. I sat down and looked at the rain streaking down the window, the city outside blurred into shapes of gray and white. When I finally left work that evening, the rain had turned heavier. The wind caught my coat as I stepped onto the sidewalk. I walked without hurry, letting the cold sink through the fabric. People rushed past me with umbrellas, but I did not open mine. The air smelled of wet asphalt and pine. By the time I reached my car, I could not tell if the damp on my face was rain or something else. The street lights reflected in shallow puddles broke in circles of light. I thought about how Ethan's anger looked more like panic, how every excuse he had ever been given had turned into a weight around his neck. When I started the engine, the heater groaned before blowing out a weak stream of air. I sat there for a moment watching the droplets slide down the windshield. I remembered what Carter had said years ago, that owning something is not about holding it forever, it is about knowing when to let go. I put the car in gear and pulled into the slow current of traffic. The rain fell harder, but it sounded cleaner than before, almost steady, like a truth that had been waiting to be heard. Chapter 7. Learning to Let Go. Spring eased in with a pale sun and a wind that smelled like wet pine, and the studio in Ballard began to feel less like a stopgap and more like a place with my name on it. I learned the sounds of the building, the rumble of the laundry machines below the soft knock of the mail carrier at noon, the neighbor who played piano badly every Sunday morning until he found the melody. I woke earlier, brewed coffee, and stood at the window while the light lifted over rooftops. My days had a rhythm that did not depend on anyone else pushing or pulling. It was not glamorous. It was mine. At Real Edge, I took on a new kind of work without changing my title. Rachel Chen joined the team fresh from licensing all nerves and careful notes, and I saw my younger self in the way her eyes flicked between the client and the contract. We met twice a week at the conference table with our laptops open and a stack of sample listings. I showed her how to read an inspection report for what it really said, and not only what it listed, how to hear the story a house tells before the seller tries to tell it for you. She asked the kind of questions that make you remember that knowing a thing is not the same as teaching it. When she closed her first small condo, she brought in pastries, and I watched the office gather around her, proud to share even a little of that moment. The calls with my parents became quieter. They had rules now for Ethan, and they followed them like a new religion. Rent due on the 1st, chores assigned on the fridge, no new money unless there was a bill with both dates and reason. My mother sounded older, but something in her tone had steadied. My father talked less about solutions and more about plans. He had stopped rescuing and started asking what the next step was, and the difference showed up in the spaces between his words. I ran into Eric Dalton at a coffee shop in Fremont on a day when the sky could not decide whether to rain. He was a former client with an easy laugh and a habit of listening before he spoke. We caught up in that shorthand you learn in cities, a handful of sentences that span a year. He asked about my move, and I told him the view from the balcony was crooked but honest. He had been looking at townhouses and asked if I had time to help him evaluate a few. He did not hover or pry, and I realized I trusted him because he did not want anything I could not give. We started touring places on Saturday mornings when inventory posted new. We walked through narrow stairwells and past fresh paint that tried to hide old flaws. I pointed out where the flashing would need attention and which builder cut corners on trim. He made notes and smiled in that grateful way that is not performance. When we talked, it stayed on the ground. He never reached for my hand. I never checked the air for what was missing. Respect felt like a warm coat you do not have to hold closed with both arms. Ethan found work through a temp agency at a logistics warehouse near the port. My mother said he left before dawn and came home tired in the heavy way of physical labor. He had a time card and a schedule and a supervisor. It sounded small, but it was new. Once on a Saturday, my father mentioned offhand that Ethan had mowed the lawn and fixed the squeaky hinge on the garage door without being asked. He did not add a lesson to it. He just said the facts and let them stand. The apartment kept teaching me to live smaller. I learned to cook in one pan, to fold shirts so they stacked like paper, to open the windows right before bed so the night air could sweep the day out. Sometimes I missed the way the old house held sound, the creak of the stairs, the slow cool of the hallway. Then I would stand on the balcony and look at the scatter of lights moving on the water and remember that quiet also has a shape and that I had not known mine. One afternoon, Rachel and I were reviewing a tricky addendum when Monica leaned into the doorway and said there was someone up front for me. I walked to reception and found Ethan standing near the window with a small grocery store bouquet wrapped in cellophane and a white envelope tucked under the rubber band. He looked cleaner than the last time I had seen him. He had shaved. His jacket was wrinkled but zipped. For a moment it felt like we were back in high school waiting for our mother to pick us up after practice, uncertain which version of ourselves would get in the car. He held out the flowers without meeting my eyes. I took them, and he cleared his throat. He said he had a minute before his shift and that he would not stay long. He reached in his pocket and pulled out the envelope, thumb running along the edge, then handed it to me like it might evaporate. Inside was a folded receipt from his first full paycheck and a small note written in careful block letters. It said that he was putting money aside every week and that he would repay what he could in cash or in work, whatever made sense. He stood there, shoulders square, and said he knew I had not saved him. He said it the way you say a truth you have resisted. He added that not being saved was the only reason he had learned how to live. He looked at me finally, and I saw the boy he had been, the man he could be, the space between them still unsteady. I told him that sometimes the best way to help someone is to stop rescuing them. My voice was simple. I did not add a lesson, I did not outline a plan, I just let the sentence land and waited. He nodded slowly. He said he was late and would call Mom from the bus. His eyes dropped to the floor and then found mine again. He thanked me without using the word. I said I hoped his day went smoothly. He left without the drama that had always followed him through doors. The automatic glass slid shut, and I watched his reflection fade into the room behind me. I brought the flowers back to my office. Rachel looked at them and then at me, but did not ask. I put them in a clean water bottle and set them by the window where the light was kind. The envelope went in the top drawer next to paper clips and sticky notes and a small collection of keys whose locks I had left behind. That evening I called my mother. She sounded tired but calm. She said she and Dad had gone for a walk after dinner and that the sky had turned the color of a bruise above the trees. She told me Ethan had come home early the night before and cooked pasta without burning it, then rinsed the dishes and wiped the counter. She said she had watched him stand at the sink and had felt something uncoil in her chest. She told me she had another therapy appointment this week and that she was learning to sit through the quiet without filling it with worry. I told her I was proud of her. For once, the phrase did not sound upside down. On Sunday, I met Eric to see a small place in Ballard with a narrow balcony and a patch of garden that could hold 3 tomato plants if someone loved them. He asked what I thought. I told him the south wall needed insulation and the gutters would need cleaning every season or moss would take the roof. He laughed and said that sounded like a yes if the price held. We drank coffee from paper cups and leaned on the railing while a gull argued with a lamppost. It was the kind of afternoon that settles instead of shines. Back home, I opened the envelope again and read the note one more time. The handwriting was uneven, the lines too hard where the pen pressed down, but there was no apology in it dressed as an excuse. It was just a record of work done and a promise that did not ask me to answer. I put it back in the drawer and closed it quietly. Night fell slow. I turned off the lamp and let the room take the soft blue of evening. Somewhere a siren cut across the neighborhood and then faded. I stood at the window with my palm on the cool glass and thought about how letting go is not a single act. It is a daily practice, a way of walking, a choice you keep making when nobody else is watching. I went to bed without checking my phone and slept through until the light found me. Chapter 8. The New Home and What Remains. The light crept through the blinds and spilled across the floor like a slow tide, and for once I woke without that familiar weight in my chest. The calendar on the wall read September 2024, a year since everything had come apart, and now it was coming together again in a quieter way. That morning I signed the final documents for my new townhouse in Ballard, 2 bedrooms, and a small garden behind a white fence that needed paint. The place cost $390,000, modest by Seattle standards, but it felt like something more than property. After taxes and debt payments, I had just enough for the down payment and a small safety fund enough to breathe. When the agent handed me the keys, I felt the strange calm that comes after a storm. Not excitement, not relief, just a steady certainty that this was right. I walked through the rooms barefoot, the air still sharp with fresh paint. The walls were blank, the sound of my steps echoing. I opened every window and let the September air roll through, cool and clean, smelling faintly of rain and cedar. The kitchen was small but bright, the kind of space where you can cook with the door open to the garden. I set my coffee mug on the counter and took a photo of the front porch with the sunlight hitting the railing. Then I sent it to Mom with a short message that said, "A house does not define a person, freedom does." She wrote back an hour later. I could almost hear her voice through the words. She said I had taught her what real love is, letting your children be responsible. The text ended with a heart simple and final, like the period at the end of a long chapter. That night, I unpacked the essentials, lined up my plates, filled the small bookshelf, and left the boxes for later. Rachel stopped by after work with a plant she said was hard to kill, a fern in a cracked ceramic pot. She walked through the place smiling and told me the light in the living room made it feel like morning even in the evening. Monica came next, carrying a bottle of wine and 2 glasses wrapped in tissue. She teased that it was about time I bought something again, then hugged me longer than she meant to. We planned a quiet housewarming for Sunday. Nothing grand, just coffee sandwiches and a few people who had walked with me through the hard part. When the day came, the weather gave us that rare September kindness, sun without glare and a breeze that carried the smell of the sea. Mom and Dad arrived first, both looking more rested than I had seen them in months. Mom brought a basket with bread and apples. Dad brought a bottle of cider he said he had been saving. They stood in the doorway for a long second, looking around, neither speaking. Then Mom smiled and said it felt peaceful. Dad nodded and asked if I had changed the locks yet. It was his version of a blessing. Rachel came with cookies and shy laughter. Monica brought music on her phone and set it near the window. We sat around the table eating, telling pieces of our lives like threads being tied together. The house did not echo anymore. It sounded lived in, even if it had only been mine for a week. Ethan arrived last. I heard his footsteps on the porch before the knock. When I opened the door, he stood there in a collared shirt, hair combed, holding an envelope in his left hand, and a small grin that looked like something learned, not inherited. He said, "Congratulations," no sarcasm, just steady eyes. I stepped aside, and he came in, greeting our parents first. He shook Dad's hand, kissed Mom's cheek, and then turned to me. He placed the envelope on the table between us. He said it was his first repayment, $1,000. Not much, but his. The room fell quiet for a moment. I looked at him and saw something new, not pride exactly, but dignity. He was not asking for approval. He was giving something back. I put my hand on his shoulder. There was no lecture left to give, nothing I needed to explain. I said it was good to see him. He nodded, looked around the room, and smiled at Rachel and Monica like he was meeting parts of my life for the first time. Mom started to cry quietly this time, the way people do when they are not broken, but finally whole. Dad lifted his glass of cider and said, "To new beginnings." We all raised ours, the clink, soft, almost fragile, and for a second everything aligned. After they left, the house fell still again, the kind of stillness that breathes. I walked out to the small garden and stood barefoot on the cool grass. The evening light slipped through the fence, striping the ground. The fern Rachel brought sat near the steps, the leaves turning toward the last of the sun. I thought about the years that had led here, about all the versions of home I had tried to build out of obligation, guilt, or hope. This one felt different. Inside, I cleaned the dishes, folded the napkins, and turned off the lights. I sat by the window with a cup of tea and looked out over the street where the lampposts glowed and a dog barked 2 houses down. My reflection looked older but settled. There were no missing pieces left to fill. In my head, I could hear Ethan's words from that day in my office, the way he said I did not save him, and how that was how he learned to live. It had sounded harsh at the time, but now it felt like truth. Maybe love was not rescue. Maybe it was the faith to let someone face their own gravity and still believe they would rise. The city hummed quietly, a train in the distance, a car door closing. The townhouse felt both small and infinite, a clean space between what had been lost and what had finally been found. I finished my tea and turned off the lamp. The darkness settled gently around me, and the silence felt like belonging. Justice does not come from courtrooms. It comes the moment you stop apologizing for living right. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It is the only way to keep love real.